Hi there, birders. Steve and Jim, EarlyBirderNet. This is in our educational birding series, and this time we'd like to talk about identifying birds.
So you decided you're going to start looking at birds because it's awesome, and you watched our videos and you were like, man, that looked kind of fun. And you watched the big year, and now you're super excited. But in North America alone, there's like 700 possible species just right off the bat that you might be looking at. And it can get super overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
So we use this system to help remember what we're looking at. And it breaks it down from 700 to a couple hundred to 100 to 50 to just a handful of possible species. And then you can really look at the small things and get the details and then find your bird.
Yeah, it can be really overwhelming as soon as you decide that you're not looking at, a duck in the pond at your park or a robin. They all start to blur together when you start. And a lot of times you don't have forever to look at a bird and identify it. Sometimes you have a second or two. And sometimes birds are really good and you get lots of time. One little cheat for that is if you can bird with a camera,
Absolutely.
it really helps because then you can elongate that identification time. Once you make an identification, then it sticks with you longer and you don't have to go through the process every time. But this in general, we still use this kind of system not as much in our day-to-day outings in birds that we're familiar with, but whenever you go to a new location, something that's drastically different than what you're used to, it's back to basics because you're going to see a lot of things and you're going to start to get really overwhelmed.
This just helps you break it down in your mind and remember what to look for, and it gives it a rough order. It's not like in order specifically. Obviously, we use the term so that it helps you remember in your mind, what you're looking for, but all of these things will get you closer to that identification.
Right.
So if you have a camera, take a picture, great. Your phone works on a lot of stuff, sometimes. Any more phones are great for zooming in and things like that. So you can get a lot of stuff now that we couldn't when we started, just
Right.
because the technology has improved. Another idea is just carry a notebook, little notepad with you, write notes of what you're seeing, real quick, what it is and what you're trying to see, just to help get you closer. And you're going to miss a bunch of them. Especially when you start, you're just not going to get them.
Right.
But you'll see that same bird again, and you already started the process. So you'll remember things, and you'll see different things, and you can just keep working through it until you get it.
And we encourage you to work through a system like this one, if not this exact system, rather than relying on somebody from a club or something like that, because they might be cutting corners or missing steps, and them just telling you what the bird is when you look at it isn't going to solidify it in your mind.
No.
When you go through and you identify the bird yourself, you're using multiple different parts of your brain, and it starts to link those things in. That way, next time you see it, this process condenses, and you look at it and you say, that's this. I remember seeing it from here before.
You're also building all those pathways in your brain so that it helps you identify other bird species and memorize those until you've got a process through where you can just expand that until...
Yeah.
Now, we're working on expanding into other countries and things like that. So you have whole different lists of birds to look at, or birds that look the same, but they're in a different country. So you got to figure those out.
Right. And it's just, if you can go through this process and build that library in your brain, it helps just by recognizing things, as what they aren't. You see something and you say it's different from everything that I've seen before.
Right.
And then you start to pay attention to it, and then you can start back at the beginning. So, salutes. We want to start with the first S in salutes. We've got size, shape, and the silhouette. This first step will help you break it down from an entire field guide's worth of birds into one chapter, if you will, in there.
Just based on the silhouette alone, you can look at it and go, okay, it looks like the shape of a duck. And this goes back to when you're just a little kid. You can identify shapes pretty quick. So even if you only see a little glimpse of them, and then it's obscured behind something, you go, okay, well, that was duck-like.
Yeah.
So it might be a goose or a duck or a swan, but it breaks it down into those categories. So then you're only looking at, 50, 60 species.
Right.
Instead of 700.
Yeah, even non-birders, they can look at something and say, that's a woodpecker, that's an owl, that's a goose, those kind of things. So first step, next thing is size. Is it the size of an eagle or is it the size of a robin?
Right.
You're not gonna be looking in your field guide for something that's eagle sized if it's sitting on your bird feeder. So, and then the silhouette, that's another section to where you might break it into a family group of if it's a robin or if it's a flycatcher or those kind of things like that. It has an outline shape that's going to be different than between a sparrow and a gull and an owl and those kind of things like that, and a crane. All of them have their different silhouettes, and so you'll use that first S to break it down into a category. And next,
a lot of times lighting will make it so that all you see is the silhouette. At certain times of day out on the water, you'll only be able to see a shape of a duck or a sandpiper or something like that. Or you're looking up at the sky and it's really bright and all you see is the crest and a big thick bill, and you go, oh well, that looks like a cardinal, and you could break it down from there. So just those simple things really helps break it
each
down.
one of these different sections might fail you, and so if most of what you have in the first section you don't get lock solid, you're going to have to rely more heavily on the rest of them. Sometimes you might only need one of them and then you're like, that's it. But that's why it's a whole combination of them. But yeah, sometimes you just see a silhouette, that's all you have to work with. Next we have the activity. While you're observing it, what is the bird doing?
Right. So is it up at the top of a tree making circles, what I call waffling? Flycatchers do this all the time, and they're out. They'll go pick a bug and then land again. They'll be watching. They'll go grab a bug and land again. Or if it's down on the ground, hopping around, foraging in the ground, it might be robin-like behavior.
Right.
Or it's pecking on the tree. Then it's a woodpecker.
Right.
That activity is a huge giveaway to eliminate a lot of other birds.
Right.
So if it's clinging to the side of a tree instead of sitting on a branch, that'll eliminate a lot of species.
Yeah, there's
It just narrows down what you're looking for. Each one of these is going to narrow down your search, and it helps you identify.
And some of the terms that you'll hear is people saying, is it a perching bird? Is it a wading bird? Those kind of things. It's describing the activity as the category of birds based on what it does. And that might be its foraging habits or things like that. Certain wading birds will walk around, even if you've categorized it as a wading bird. What they're doing would help you to decide, is it running up and down the beach when the tide or the waves come in? Does it go up when the wave comes in and run back out? That's a key identifier for certain shorebirds. Or if it's out in the water and it's probing, those kind of things are one of the things that you're going to want to really lock in. What is the bird doing? Because I guarantee you're not going to see an owl pecking a hole in the side of a tree, and you're not going to see a bald eagle, pecking a hole in the side of a tree. So, when you see what it's doing, that's going to be the next thing.
It really helps a lot.
Yeah. Next thing you're going to be looking at is the geographic location here.
Now, guides help a lot with this because there are birds that are specific to the regions. So if you're in the western states and you're looking at a bird and you go, oh, I think that's an eastern bluebird, it's not going to be an eastern bluebird because they're not in the western states.
Right.
Same thing with meadowlarks. But there are geographic locations specific for the birds you're looking for.
Yeah.
So if you go in your mind, you go, oh, I think it's this, and you check your range map and it shows that it's not there, there's a really good chance that that's not it. Right. It does occasionally happen,
right?
But you want to definitely check that first, so you can
especially in those overlap birds. Zones,
and especially when you're first starting out, you're not going to be looking for rare birds. Really, focus on the main birds. Focus on the species that it shows are in your area, because once you can identify those and really nail that down, then you can say, okay, these are the birds it looks like, and it's definitely not one of those. But it's a learning process to get to that point.
Yeah, so even if you say that's a woodpecker, you can immediately eliminate woodpeckers from the opposite side of the country. Like I said, there's those overlap zones. Like in Montana, for instance, with the screech owls, we have both western and eastern screech owls in Montana, and there's a transition zone that's not a rigid line. There's an overlap area. But
birds fly.
Yeah.
And they don't care about lines on maps.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes it kind of difficult sometimes.
Yeah, so that's the general geographic location. Next would be breaking it down. So say you've determined the size and what it's doing, and if it belongs in your state or not, then you're down to looking at unique markings.
These are huge.
Yeah.
It really, really helps. So, like, a lot of birds have bars on their wings that are a completely different color than the rest of their body, or their belly's a completely different color, or their head's a different color, or, you know, their bill's a different size and shape. These all help a lot. Like a woodpecker looks different than a duck.
Right.
So those bill shapes are going to help a lot in identifications.
Yeah, and some of it is so detailed that it might be the only thing that you can use to tell the difference is if there's a ring around the eye, or if there's a partial ring around the eye,
Right.
or if there's an eyebrow mark above or below, or, you know, these
Right.
different parts of the
their
face.
head color might come below the eye or above the eye, and that's two different species that look almost
Right.
the same.
Yeah, and so the unique markings is the next step of basically detail. When you've narrowed it down between all the rest of these groups, that might be the clincher to help you decide, you know, if that's the bird that you think it is. The next thing we have here is the time of year, the time of day. Obviously, you think of owls and things like that as being nocturnal birds, things like nightjars, nighthawks, anything in that family. You're not that you can't see them in the middle of the day.
It's just less likely.
Right. You're gonna be looking for certain things depending on when. It seems like a lot of birds tend to be more active when the sun first starts coming up in the morning. You know, and so during that high activity period is a good time to be out and identifying birds.
Mm-hmm.
But then also the time of year, there's like the first thing I think of in Montana is shrikes. We have loggerhead shrikes that are here in the summertime, and we have northern shrikes that are here in the wintertime, and they're, you know, there's a little bit of different specific markings, but we tend to skip this over and just, you know, we say if it's the first, if we're counting our new year birds at the beginning of the year and we see a shrike, there's a really good chance that that's going to be a northern shrike and not a loggerhead shrike, which we'll expect to see in the middle of the summertime. So that just helps take off the workload of identifying that bird because we're using that information about the timing of it.
Yeah. It also ties in with migration. So a lot of the birds that you'll see in the summertime just aren't here in the winter or the fall.
Yeah.
They head south. They're gone for the winter. Mm-hmm. You're not going to see them except for on very rare occasions.
Right.
So
in Montana, the number of species significantly reduces in the wintertime. Whereas if you're on one of the coastal areas or if you're in southern Texas or something like that, that might be the destination of birds that migrate to the south and stop in that area. So you might get an influx of birds in your area during the winter. But for us, this amount of birds that we have to identify in the wintertime is reduced, and so that might make it easier. You might consider that as a time of year to start birding because it's less overwhelming.
Absolutely. It's also going to tie in with the unique markings. A lot of birds have different plumage during breeding season.
Right.
A breeding season is much easier to identify most bird species because they're bright colors or they're really crisp coloring on them, and it makes it a lot easier instead of like off breeding or out of breeding season. A lot of ducks look very similar when they're not in breeding plumage, so it makes it more difficult to identify specifically between each individual species.
Right. And then the unique marking part would have to do with age also. You know,
oh, that's true.
Yeah. The age of the bird matters a lot, and sometimes you might be seeing birds that all look the same because they're juveniles or it's their first year or second year. Gulls are really hard like that, where they have like 2-3 years of transitional plumages and before they're in their adult plumage, and then they're a lot easier to identify.
And then when they get older, they kind of revert back to that drab, muted plumage.
Yeah.
Bald eagles is another good example. A lot of people misidentify bald eagles, juvenile bald eagles, because they don't have the characteristic white head until they're like 4 or 5 years old before they actually get that white head. So a lot of people see it, it's a brown eagle. They can see it's an eagle, but they assume it's a golden eagle, even though it's just a juvenile bald eagle. Right. There's specific ways to determine that, but you have to pay attention to those differences.
Yeah, you'll have to pay attention to a lot of these other features to help you determine those things. The next we have the E for the environment, and so that would be, it could be as small as what part of the tree they're foraging on. So you're looking at this activity, where are they at doing that activity? It could be if it's on the trunk of the tree, if it's out on the tips of the trees, dangling off the ends of them, if they're at the very top,
all the way at the bottom.
And a lot of field guides might tell you that they'll be, 10 to 15 feet up off the ground, and a specific species of tree is where they like to hang out. Where other birds, just based on their behavior that they have, you'll expect to see them at the tip tops of trees in certain habitats.
Right, and that's what this really gets into in the environment is the habitat. Like, where are they? Like, are you in deciduous forest? Are you in pine forest? Are you up on the top of a mountain? Are you down in a swamp somewhere?
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to see some birds in specific areas,
Right.
and you're not going to see them in others. Like, very, very unlikely to see a whole flock of, ducks at the peak of a mountaintop hanging out with ptarmigan.
Right.
So,
And the same with like the ocean, there's like coastal birds, and then there's birds that don't come any closer. They like to be in that pelagic zone where the water's over 1,000 feet deep, and they don't,
you have to go out to see
yeah,
them.
you have to go see them. That's why things like wildlife management areas and reserves are really helpful, because they'll have certain environments that you can't find anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the locations we're going has a mix of tall and short grass prairie, which most of that has been, just a deteriorated habitat in most of the United States. And so if you go to an area that still has preserved that habitat, then you're going to find a lot of things a lot easier there.
Mm-hmm.
And so knowing those environments and what you're going to see in those environments, because there's certain grouse that you're going to see in a short grass prairie that you're not going to see in an alpine, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so you got to take that into account.
It's a really good way to identify specific birds. If you're out hunting for a specific species, if you are in an area where you're surrounded by pine trees, and there's pine trees as far as you can see in mountains, and there's one spot with a couple of acres and it's that open fields and prairie, that's the place to go to find all those birds, because they literally have nowhere else that they like to be. They'll stop in that location.
Mm-hmm.
That's why early migration and ponds and stuff, if it freezes over and it's frozen all winter, that first bit that thaws out, you're going to have huge variety of waterfowl, because that's the only open water.
Yeah.
It makes identification and seeing a lot of different species quicker and easier.
And a lot of this is just knowing what the birds need. That they all require something, and if you can find those locations where they are getting that need fulfilled, then you're really setting yourself up for success for identifying those birds. And then the last thing we have on the list is the sounds that the birds are making. It could be the calls that they're making. They could be singing a song depending on the time of year or the time of day. Mm-hmm. They could be making alarm calls just from you walking into the environment and them talking to each other, letting the other birds know that there's something in the habitat that they're not used to being around.
Or specific species do other things. Grouse will flap their wings in a certain way, and it
makes a thumping
noise. Or woodpeckers make specific beat patterns depending on the species.
Yeah, if it's a slow, deep thump, 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 that could just be a foraging peck, whereas a fast trilling drum could be something of the equivalent of like a mating call, where they're sending out this message into the world that I'm here and I'm available. And so there's going to be tons of different noises that you're going to be listening to, and as you're going through the woods, you're going to hear all these different things, and it might be down to all the rest of these things match with species, and the only thing that tells the difference in them is the sound.
Mm-hmm.
And something that comes to mind is flycatchers. Can be really confusing, but they all have a unique call. And so if you can hear that flycatcher make a specific call, then you can clinch it, because there's multiple flycatchers in the same kind of habitat. They do the same kind of fly catching activities. That might be the last bit of evidence, and it really was what it is. It's an investigation to identify the bird, and that might be the piece of evidence that you need. So that's why we put that one down at the end. If all else fails, you might make it down to sound, and so if you see us out in our birding trips and we're stumped on something, we see the behavior, we know it's a bird in this specific habitat, and it could be one or two things, then we're using this. And sometimes all of these things aren't going to do it for you, and that's okay.
You just don't get them sometimes.
Sometimes a bird will stump you.
The other thing with sounds is sometimes that's the first indication that you get that there's a bird there. Now you're walking through, there's trees all over, there's birds flying all over the place, you're distracted, and you hear a specific call that you recognize or something that's unique. Then that gives you the chance to stop and look for it. Owls are really good with that because it's dark.
Yeah.
You're out in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night, it's dark, you're in no man's land, and you're listening specifically for a hoot or a call. And then you can pursue that animal.
Yeah. So, these are just tools to help you break that down, whether it be a new location or if you're just new to birding and you don't know where to begin. Write down this list here, salute, and it might help you with your identification process.
Absolutely.
And it's all right if you don't get it. You'll see the bird again eventually, or, you'll learn more and more and more, and you'll be able to deduce what it is the more you learn about birding. But, don't try and skip the steps and make it something you want it to be. I tend to do that a lot. I get excited, I'll make a quick judgment on what it is, and then I have to go back and then work through these slower. I say, that's this bird, and then I'm looking at it and I'm like going through this list in my mind and thinking, I don't think it is what I thought it was when I first looked at it, and so you got to slow down and be careful. Don't make it a bird that you want it to be just because you haven't got it on your list yet.
And if you don't get it, and you don't get it, don't write it down. Don't just make a guess. It's okay. You're not going to get them all, but eventually you will.
Yeah.
It just takes time. You're going to see the same birds again.
Yeah.
You're going to get more opportunity to identify them.
And when you finally do identify a bird you've been working on, you just get this sense of relief and fulfillment and excitement.
It's so satisfying.
Yeah. And like we said, sometimes this whole process might take a second or two. You might just see it and know the behavior, and there's no other bird that does that specific behavior. And you can draw it out of that library in your mind, and you're just going to be crushing these bird identifications, and you won't need to go through this list until you hit a stumper. And that's when it gets really exciting.
That's great. Now, all this information, you're thinking to yourself, how the heck am I supposed to know what the birds look like and sound like and where they fly? And that is in our next episode. So go ahead and check that out. And thanks for watching. We'll see you guys around.
Bye.